months. All right, that is our newsmaker of the day, the Egypt presidential elections results. Now, as you will recall, a year after the successful Egyptian revolution to overthrow the regime of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, the first free presidential elections took place in the country on the 23rd and 24th of May. Egypt saw 50% of its 15 million eligible voters turn out to cast their vote. 13 candidates were in the running, among which Mohammed MURSI, chairman of the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party, and AHMED SHAFIK, former Prime Minister of Egypt, received the most votes. That's according to unofficial results or data that came in today. The official announcement of the results is expected to take place tomorrow. Thereafter, the two top candidates will contest a runoff election, that is the final round, scheduled on 16th and 17th of June. Now, despite its candidate entering the final round, internal estimates point to the Muslim Brotherhood's waning popularity as its vote fell by almost half compared to the lower house parliamentary elections that took place 6 months ago. Though the results are not yet official, the Electoral Commission says they're only indicative. News agencies report that both MURSI and SHAFIK have already been reaching out to their former rivals in a bid to assemble a coalition of support for the second round. But so far, none of their major rivals, including Abul Futu, the third-placed Nasirist Hamdeen Sabahi, or former Foreign Minister Amr Musa, have publicly backed either front-runner. So does this election result put Egypt between a rock and a hard place, between a hardline Islamist president and a former Mubarak regime member in the post? Well, to give us more perspective, I have with me KARIN MAREE. She's editor and Middle East analyst of the Economist Intelligence Unit. KARIN joins me on the line from London. KARIN, thank you very much. What do you make of the outcome? Though again, I will stress here, this is unofficial result and not the final outcome as we expect tomorrow.
I mean, it was always likely that the Muslim Brotherhood was going to perform well. It was able to mobilize its grassroots support and extensive networks in Egypt. So it's really not surprising that Mohammed MURSI appears to have come first in this election. What is more surprising, of course, is that AHMED SHAFIK has performed so well. He was the last prime minister appointed by Hosni Mubarak before he stepped down in February 2011, and so he's seen as, you know, a member of that old regime and also as the army's preferred candidate. So it's a bit of a step back, really, in terms of what the revolution had hoped to achieve. I mean, it seems like, you know, the votes he secured were from people wanting Egypt to return to a more secure and stable footing. He promised that he could deliver that, and also probably what you had was a lot of supporters of the former National Democratic Party also voting for him.
So, KARIN, is there any way to assess who has a better chance to make it to the presidential seat now that it's a final runoff between these two candidates?
It's very difficult. I mean, we're hearing a lot that, you know, a lot of people are going to abstain from voting because they're disappointed by this outcome. It's going to be very divisive. You know, the Muslim Brotherhood has lost some of its appeal since securing the largest number of seats in Parliament. Even its own supporters have been disillusioned by it. So there's a greater sort of distrust of the Brotherhood since the parliamentary election. At the same time, you know, the people who did support the revolution are going to be very wary of wanting to install Shafik in the presidential seat. So it's going to be a very divisive second round.
Well, as you've pointed out, the options are not very appealing, especially not from what the revolution had hoped to achieve. Is it fair for me to say Egypt seems to be between a rock and a hard place, because you've got on the one hand an Islamist presidential candidate and on the other a member of the former regime, as you've pointed out, that was not what this revolution was meant to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's you know, it's easy to sort of simplify and say that. Something to bear in mind is that Egypt does not yet have a new constitution, and it's not in fact clear what powers the new president will have. So we have to wait and see what actually comes out of efforts to write this new constitution. It might be that well, it's likely to be that this president will not be as powerful as as the former one.
All right. Explain to me how this constitution writing exercise is going to take place. Will the parliament have a big role to play in that? And if that is the case, then the Muslim Brotherhood, as you pointed out, does have a dominant position in the parliament and now has one of their candidates potentially in the presidential seat.
Yeah, it's the debate over how this is going to happen that's actually led to the delay in having the Constitution. Initially, it was said that there would be a 100-member assembly that would be appointed by Parliament to write the Constitution. Earlier this year, the Muslim Brotherhood sort of had already formed this assembly. It was then dissolved by a court ruling because it was deemed to be too much leaning towards the Muslim Brotherhood's preferences. So there's been a lot of argument around this, and they still haven't formed the assembly. The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces had at one point said it would issue an addendum to the Constitution as it stands now, outlining the President's competencies, but as you can imagine, that did not go down well with most of the political forces in the country because it was seen as trying to kind of supersede the legitimate process that was already in place to formulate a new constitution.
Well, I'm just reading, Karin, that Egypt's ultra-conservative Salafist Al-Noor party has announced that it will back the Muslim Brotherhood. I understand the two final candidates are now lobbying with the other candidates who are in the race and their followers to be able to gain the maximum following or the majority, so to speak. Are we to anticipate now a dominance of what many people call the hardline Islamist party, the Muslim Brotherhood, in both the governing of Egypt as well as the presidential powers, whatever the powers be in Egypt? And in that case, is it likely that Sharia law will be imposed, as has been the proposal by the Islamist parties?
I think we're getting ahead of ourselves here a bit. Okay. The Muslim Brotherhood is, of the Muslim Brotherhood or the Salafis, the Muslim Brotherhood is the more moderate force here, and Absolutely. So far they've shown themselves to be quite pragmatic, and they've been reluctant to sort of put themselves out there and make extreme statements about what their intentions are. If and when they form a government, it's likely to include a big number of technocrats, and I imagine that they will be reluctant to take sort of the front seat in driving policy going forward. The fact that they've been backed
Karin, if I can interrupt you there, but
Sure.
Didn't they say that they didn't even intend to put up a presidential candidate and thereafter have gone back on their word and in fact put up a presidential candidate? So it seems that maybe that's not exactly the line we could believe?
That is true, but again, as I say, they've been quite pragmatic. They realized that it was in their interest to do that, so they put a candidate forward. This was part of the problem or part of the problem they've had with their image since the parliamentary election. That's one of the reasons that they've lost support even amongst their base. Having said that they would not put a presidential candidate forward, they then did so. They were also seen to have been allied with the military at some point and reluctant to criticize crackdowns on protesters. It was quite late in the game that they changed their stance and then began demanding that the army hand over power to a civilian government. But again, they did react, so they've been quite inconsistent and pragmatic. I don't think they have a clear policy in mind at this stage. I don't think there's any kind of master plan to introduce Sharia law in the immediate future. No.
All right, so I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, as you pointed out, but I do want to put this final question to you. It is in itself an achievement that they've had their first presidential elections, and I don't want to take away from that. These are all baby steps towards some returning of normalcy, if it can be called that, to Egypt, and the advent of democracy. What do you make of how far the process has unfolded so far, keeping the key goal in mind, that is a democratic setup in Egypt, and what that means for Egypt's economy as well?
In terms of the formal process, this is the final hurdle, really. The army has said that it will hand power over to a civilian government once a new president is in place, and that should happen by the 1st of July, assuming that the second round of voting goes ahead as scheduled. After that, I think we're going to see some more sort of political maneuvering as the Muslim Brotherhood tries to form a coalition government. There's going to be a lot of back and forth about who will join that coalition, etc. In terms of the economy, I mean, there can't be an economic recovery until there is greater political stability, and the economy at the moment is still performing quite poorly. The currency is still under a lot of pressure. There has been no inflow of new foreign investment pretty much since the revolution. The other thing that's still on the back burner is a proposed $3.2 billion loan from the IMF, which has now been put on hold until after the presidential election, because the IMF has said it needs to see some kind of political consensus around that loan before it dispenses it. That loan really is critical to other donors and also investors seeing Egypt in a more positive light again, and rekindling confidence in the economy and in the government's creditworthiness.
All right. Karin, you've given us a perspective on what's in store and the challenges ahead. Thank you very much for joining us. That's Karin MAREE, editor and Middle East analyst of the Economist Intelligence Unit, joining us from London to give us a sense of what the presidential election final run-up will throw up. We will get the official outcome